Well, I think hello everybody, good morning. I think we're going to get started. People might still be trickling in as they do, and so if they do, we'll welcome them as they come. But thank you for coming to our panel on the Writer's Witness book, The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Kolbert. My name is Adam Temashasky. I'm chair of the Writer's Witness Committee. I'm also part of the Writing Studies program, which, as you may or may not know, is housed under the Department of Literature. I also teach a complex problems course on evil, which seems to possibly also intersect with our Writer's Witness text to some degree. My fellow panelists.
Hi, I'm Karen Nee. I'm an associate professor in environmental science, and I teach classes related to these topics and have used segments of this book in my class. So.
I'm Kelly Joyner. I'm Adam's colleague in writing studies, tasked with teaching the Sixth Extinction, along with every other Writer's Witness text, which he's going to talk about.
And so to give you a rough sense of how we're going to do this panel to the next hour and 15 minutes, roughly hour and 10 minutes, hour and 5 minutes, however long it happens to be. I don't know how familiar some of you may or may not be with the program, so I'm just going to give a very brief overview on that. Talk about some of our past selections and how we've been striving more and more recently, I would say, toward a more interdisciplinary, multidiscipline kind of book that has a lot of tendrils that can go out. Then we'll talk a little specifically about the book, and then I've gathered syllabi from around the web that I could find that professors had posted publicly to give you a sense of how it's been used thus far around the academic world. And then Karen has actually used parts of it, and will be using parts of it in the upcoming semester. So I'm going to let her talk a bit about how she's used it, students' reactions to it, things like that. And then we're going to have a conversation about your own disciplines and how it might intersect with yours, things that come up from that. And then we're going to end, ideally, with a conversation about challenges, things that students might be challenged by and ways that students might challenge us when they come into the classroom with it. And so that's sort of my opening spiel. Are there any sort of introductory questions that raises that we can knock out of the box? Yes?
Will you put a brief summary of the book?
Yes. Yeah, in fact, I'm going to open with that. Okay. So, fantastic. So there's actually a couple things about it that we'll get to that summary in a moment. These have been, for the last few years, just to show you in case you haven't been around or even been necessarily paying attention to what's been selected. To give you a sense, go back to 2013, the kind of book. So last year we had Arlie Hochschild's book, Strangers in Their Own Land, which is, the subtitle is Anger and Mourning on the American Right. So she had spent 5 years going into sort of what she calls Tea Party country in the Louisiana chemical belt, getting to know them, trying to figure out like what makes someone who, and she used environmentalism as her keyhole issue, what makes someone who seems to be harmed by the Republican Party's policies continue to vote for them. And so that was her way into that community, and then she tried to come with an answer to that. 2 years before now, was Jeff Chang's book, We're Gonna Be All Right, which was a series of essays. The subtitle gives away its kind of focused notes on resegregation. So he looked at things like Ferguson, Beyonce's Lemonade, trying to get a sense or pass along a sense of where America was in terms of actually resegregating back despite some popular opinions to the contrary. Before that was the local writer, Ruben Castaneda. Some of you might know from the Washington Post. He was a reporter. This was about his years reporting on the crack epidemic while being a crack user. So it was an inside look at that world. Jess Alexander was a diplomat. She's an NGO worker. So Chasing Chaos was her memoir about the different postings she had, what it was like being an NGO worker and what it was like being a woman in the world of NGO workers. Brooke Gladstone from NPR. Some of you may or may not know, she did a graphic, I don't want to call it a novel because it was nonfiction, she did a graphic nonfiction book called The Influencing Machine about media. The origins of it, the origins of its influence, the current state of its influence, how money works in media. And then Eula Biss, back in 2013, Notes from No Man's Land. She's also an essayist. It was a series of essays about race in America, gender in America. And so that gives you hopefully a sense of what we've been looking for. I have been chair since the end of Jeff Chang's section through now. And so as chair, when we're guiding the conversations, we are talking about, well, how might other profs use this in our own writing studies courses? What are the ways that it might have more dimensions to it than mere rhetoric? Like Karen and I were discussing, as writing studies teachers, we tend to focus mostly on the rhetoric of the book. How do they structure their argument? What do you learn about evidence? What do you learn about persuasion? How to appeal to an audience? But, we've got 1,700 some kids coming in who have all read this, and they're taking more than our classes, apparently, I didn't know that. But they have other classes that they worry about. And so they'll be in your rooms having read this. And so this panel is, well, how might you sort of, carry that momentum forward into your own courses? Where might there be intersections, things to think about? Any questions on that? This is, I believe, our 20th or 21st year. 21st, the year that we've been doing the Writers' Witness program. I'm very happy with that. Okay, so of course this year's selection is Elizabeth Kolbert's The Sixth Extinction. If you don't know her, she's has done a lot of writing for different magazines, journals, but most notably for The New Yorker. She's been sort of their environmental go-to now for the past decade plus, which is how I came across her way back when. She won an award for her series on climate change from some science magazine. I forget the name of it now. But so, not knowing how many of you had had a chance to read it or finish it, I just want to give you a brief synopsis of it and let actually her do a lot of the work of it. But looking at the table of contents, I thought would be a nice way in to understanding what she had done. You can see what she does is she takes different animals throughout and she uses them as a gateway into a larger conversation. So for instance, the sea around us, she starts talking about how marine creatures have been impacted and how they are evidence of the past 5 extinctions, how they're evidence of the ongoing 6th extinction. So she uses each of these things as a way in. I actually thought that structure might be a way that people in other classes think about how the book could help them. If you were going to talk to students about your own discipline, what would be the keyhole issues or subjects or specifics that get you into the bigger issues that you want to pass along. And then at the end, her final chapter, I'm going to show you an excerpt from her opening and from her closing. I'm going to let her kind of explain what she's doing and why. But she ends by giving a sense of wrapping it up, but as we'll see in a minute, not in an easy, hopeful way. And I want to pass that along, because I've read some reviews that get her last chapter wrong, and so I just want to sort of set the stage for that. So this is from the end of her introduction, her prologue. And so I put this up here so you can see her explanation of what's going on. Excuse me. The story of the 6th extinction, at least as I've chosen to tell it, comes in 13 chapters. Each tracks a species that is in some way emblematic. The American mastodon, the great auk, an ammonite that disappeared at the end of the Cretaceous alongside the dinosaurs. The creatures in the early chapters are already gone, and this part of the book is mostly concerned with the great extinctions of the past and the twisting history of their discovery, starting with the work of the French naturalist Georges Cuvier. The second part of the book takes place very much in the present, in the increasingly fragmented Amazon forest, on a fast-warming slope in the Andes, on the outer reaches of the Great Barrier Reef. I chose to go to these particular places for the usual journalistic reasons, because there was a research station there, or because someone invited me to tag along on an expedition. Such is the scope of changes now taking place that I could have gone pretty much anywhere, and with the proper guidance found signs of them. One chapter concerns a die-off happening more or less in my own backyard, and quite possibly in yours. If extinction is a morbid topic, mass extinction is, well, massively so. It's also a fascinating one. In the pages that follow, I try to convey both sides, the excitement of what's being learned as well as the horror of it. My hope is that readers of this book will come away with an appreciation of the truly extraordinary moment in which we live. So, looking at the table of contents in that, I think that hopefully sets the ground for what she does. And then at the end, I've got 2 excerpts, and I want to particularly point to the first paragraph here leading into it from 265. Kanoe's tragicomic sex life provides more evidence, if any more was needed, of how seriously humans take extinction. Such is the pain the loss of a single species causes that we're willing to perform ultrasounds on rhinos and handjobs on crows. That's what Kanoe was doing, by the way. Certainly, the commitment of people like Terry Roth and Barbara Durant and institutions like the Cincinnati and San Diego zoos could be invoked as reasons for optimism. And if this were a different kind of book, I would. I've come across a couple reviews that stop at optimism, as if suggesting, she ends the book on this rosy note of their hopes for optimism. But of course, the last sentence undoes that. So I really wanted to make sure I pass that along, because one of the things we've found in the past, at least I think we found writing studies, students tend to be skeptical of, after a long book of all these difficult things, the author's like, and here's how we'll fix it. And so they use that as a way, because our students are 18, 19 years old. They're looking for ways to establish their academic bona fides, their own intellectual thing, and they think that has to come about through being contrary. That's a pretty good passage to say, no, she doesn't want to end the book by giving you hope. She points to some things that are going on that one could sort of explore, but as she says, that's not what she's been out to do. She says, though many of the preceding chapters have been devoted to the extinction or near extinction of individual organisms, the Panamanian golden frog, the great auk, the Sumatran rhino, my real subject has been the pattern they participate in. What I've been trying to do is trace an extinction event. Call it the Holocene extinction, or the Anthropocene extinction, or, if you prefer the sound of it, the Sixth Extinction, and to place this event in the broader context of life's history. Right, and so the book really, I would argue, it is much more reportorial than some sort of urging for action at the end. She just wants to say to people, if you don't know what's going on, this is what's going on. Here's how we know what we know, basically. That history is neither strictly uniformitarian nor catastrophist. Rather, it is a hybrid of the two. What this history reveals, in its ups and downs, is that life is extremely resilient, but not infinitely so. There have been very long, uneventful stretches, and very, very occasionally, quote, revolutions on the surface of the earth. And then from the very end. Obviously, the fate of our own species concerns us disproportionately. But at the risk of sounding anti-human, some of my best friends are human. I will say that it is not, in the end, what is most worth attending to. Right now, in the amazing moment that to us counts as the present, we are deciding, without quite meaning to, which evolutionary pathways will remain open and which will forever be closed. No other creature has ever managed this, and it will, unfortunately, be our most enduring legacy. The Sixth Extinction will continue to determine the course of life long after everything people have written and painted and built has been ground into dust and giant rats have, or have not, inherited the earth, which is a reference to something earlier in the book. So that is, I hope, does it give you a good sense of the book? Are there any other questions about the contents that we can answer before we go more into it? Great. Okay. So I've got just some snippets of syllabi to quickly look through. I won't continue to bore you by reading them, but I just want to sort of highlight the different ways that it's been used to kind of help generate our conversation to follow about ways that you all might use it. So this is a class, Earth 144, Climate Change in the Age of Humans. And here's a description. The first year seminar explores how climate change and humans have influenced each other through time. Topics include the role of climate change on human evolution, the collapse of civilizations, the spread of diseases and migration. Topics also include examples of the human impact on climate and the origins of the Anthropocene. This is an anthropology course on extinction. Takes a multi-perspective, interdisciplinary approach to understanding the reality and idea of the extinction process. The specific focus is a critical examination of extinction as a challenge of the 21st century. Topics include extinctions of fossil hominins, extinctions of cultures, religions and ethnic groups, language endangerment and death, extinctions of other organisms caused by humans, and the imagined extinction of our own species. Good times? This is a first-year writing seminar, and I found a couple of these, so I've just included one because the other one was roughly in the same boat. Reading and writing the Anthropocene. So here's the overview that the professor provides. You can get through it. This is just the sort of boilerplate about what's going on in the Anthropocene. This is the second bit of it. Can there be a more powerful concept or a more frightening one? Yet the scientists, philosophers, essayists, and activists who have looked deeply at the concept of the Anthropocene, most of them anyway, tell us this is not about apocalypse. The end is not near if by end we mean the imminent destruction of our planet and ourselves. The Anthropocene instead is a transformation, and where it will take us is both unknowable and entirely dependent on the choices we humans make, both individually and collectively. Our inability to know our future does not leave us powerless, however, because a rich body of scholarly and popular work has already scoured this terrain and can assist us in our own explorations. In this class, we will mine this work, approaching the Anthropocene as both a scientific and cultural construction. We will read, research, and write, and most of all, we will think, all with the goal of understanding how we got here and where we might go next. This is a sustainability course. There's a couple of these also, as you might imagine. I've got another one to show you too. The idea of conservation, of course, is linked to this book. And so courses that will teach that tend to run into it. So this was energy and sustainability in contemporary culture. You'll consider the subject matter in light of humanistic values, where the science, ideas, and assertions presented in the selected media are critically valued relative to the viability of our planet's ability to support life. The next one is another literature class, The End of Nature, Anthropocene Literature. This one is interesting. I put out a couple different segments of it, excerpts of it, so you can see what they want to do. In addition to reading, viewing lots of work that reflects the experience of humans in a geological epoch of their own making, you'll also be hunting down material that you think should be counted in the as-yet-to-be-established canon of Anthropocene arts and letters. So kind of a neat way of thinking from the literature side. Well, let's imagine we're putting together an anthology of writing about this time period, Quab time period. What would you pick? Nearing the end, biodiversity and climate change. And then Living and Dying in the Anthropocene as a political course, which I thought was very exciting for what we're doing today. And that kind of bleeds into, here's where I want to start. Furthermore, the Anthropocene marks the first area of political geology, which seems like sort of a new, interesting phrase. For the first time in human history, political movements and even some governments are asking what responsibility we have to respond to these dramatic changes. We have to take responsibility for the geological future of our planet if we want humans to continue to thrive on this planet. This course will focus on how the Anthropocene, and in particular the, quote, great acceleration since industrialization, challenges our political institutions and political imaginations. So that might be a surprising way that her book shows up in a class, in this poli-sci class that gives the policy ramifications of it. And then finally, I found a semester at sea course syllabus from a conservation biology course, which I primarily included just to show the variety of different places this book has been used. Kelly found a high school, that's a Catholic high school, I believe, that's been using the book. So it's got legs for various constituencies, and of course that's what we're here to talk about. On that note, Karen has used it and will be using it, so I'm going to turn over to her to talk a little bit about her experiences.
Sure. Okay, so I don't actually have a PowerPoint. I'm just going to talk to you guys. Can I ask real quickly, like, what programs are y'all from, or do you teach in? Humanities. Education. Economics. Okay. Library. Any sciences? No. Okay. All right. Well, so I guess I feel like I had kind of this book is a really natural fit with one of the habits of mind classes I teach, which is called The Nature of Earth. And so it meets the natural science habits of mind area of scientific inquiry. And it focuses on sort of the more living aspects of the Earth system. We have a second course that focuses more on the non-living aspects of the Earth system. So it has chapters about population growth, nutrient cycling, ecosystems, evolution, extinction, invasive species. It has a whole chapter on biosphere too. So it covers actually some similar topics to the ones in this book. And I think I first heard about this book, I think on NPR. They had a little segment of it where they were interviewing her, and it had the part where they were describing the bird hand job kind of at length.
Classic NPR.
Yeah, they were, and also this part where the corals were spawning, which she was really impressed by.
Environmental sex.
That's right.
Yeah, and I was honestly, I look for stuff like that in my classes because, as you probably know, a lot of our students are really science phobic. They think science is boring, hard, and doesn't really relate to them. And so I feel like when I did a brief stint as a science journalist way back, and basically, anytime you can put in sex, death, catastrophe, or your own health, that's what people want to know about. And so I just try that in my class a lot. And so I played this clip. It's a 7-minute clip. And the other really interesting thing she brings up in the clip, which I thought was very meaningful, I don't know if it might be in the last chapter, which I didn't get to reread, is that a lot of times we think, lots of us, especially my students that are environmentally concerned, they sort of think of environmental choices as like moral choices, like doing the right thing, like being a good person. And she makes this point that there's a lot of things that we think of as being a good person, like a lot of these tendencies and impulses that we have, that as a side effect destroy the earth. Like not because they're bad, but just because they're part of who we are, and like we are kind of out of hand right now. So things like, this book that you're reading to educate yourself, this was produced by cutting down trees, using fossil fuels, like using some dyes, all this stuff, but even like more basic things, like our ability to collaborate with each other. She kind of gets into that with the Neanderthals. It's like we have kind of an amazing ability to accomplish things together, but that ability has enabled us to wreak havoc on the earth. Without that, we wouldn't be able to do that. Also, like the fact that we like a lot of altruistic tendencies, our desire to explore. And she was like, you can't really think of it as like bad. You have to think of it in more practical terms of like, what are the effects? Like, sort of what do we need to do to change the outcome, not that it's the result of some sort of moral failure. And I thought that was really good, because I feel like thinking of it as a moral failure just isn't getting anyone anywhere. And it's not really accurate either. And so usually I played that, and then I mainly used it to talk about invasive species and extinction, because extinction was one of our main units. But I think as I was rereading it, for my class, it doesn't only have first years, so I think what I'm going to do is select a couple chapters and post those for the students, and then kind of use them as, we have these like reflection paper readings where it's like things like TED Talks or New York Times articles that I have them read and reflect on. And so I think I'm probably just going to put a couple of chapters as that. I particularly liked, let's see, I think I was definitely going to use the one about ocean acidification, because that's a topic that is not covered really in it used to be covered in our textbook, and then the textbook like got a new edition, and now it doesn't have a chapter on ocean acidification. So I think I'm just going to use this. And I guess for me, I kind of use it more to illustrate technical scientific concepts in a way that is more engaging for students, and kind of shows the outcomes and provides like vivid images. I haven't really approached it from analyzing the writing as much, but yeah.
If I could just piggyback, that chapter on ocean acidification I particularly liked, because the science behind climate change, right, is sometimes difficult for people to put their heads around grasp. But she talks about this island off the coast of Italy, Castello or
Castello Aragonese.
There you go. And it's got these vents underneath that are pumping out these
bubbles of carbon dioxide.
Right.
I actually did research in a place that had vents like that, and participated in similar. Like this research caught on, because once someone was doing it, everyone was like, "Yes, we need to get on this bandwagon."
That's cool. And I think students will like that chapter, because the way the island works, right, is scientists have the idea, like, the closer we get to it, the more we're getting to look in the future of what an acidic ocean will look like. And so you start far away from the island, and you take a census of the animals that are there. And you move closer and closer to the vents as the carbonic acid rises, and you notice how things die off. And so you can say, well, if ocean acidification goes on for the next 150 to 150 years, we'll be at X place in the ocean now by this island. And I thought, well, students are really going to be able to sort of grasp that. It's not esoteric. It's not like some sort of like a lot of chemical formula. It's really a straightforward, common sense way to do science. I thought this chapter will probably help students who want to be able to say, look, I know that climate change is going to be bad. I know that the oceans matter. Here's a chapter that gives them an easy way to wrap their brain around it.
Yeah.
Now I thought what we could do is I have a couple. I think maybe forget the small groups, because we're a relatively small group now. I thought we might have twice as many. But so we might be able to pull this together and just get the conversation going. These are just some questions that I thought would be of interest to people that wanted to be here today. How does your own discipline intersect with it? Right? I mean, it's a book about extinction, about biology, to a degree about conservation, though really that's like subsidiary to these things are going on now, so you should conserve. But she doesn't really go deep in that. So where you're coming from, how might other people hear about these intersections? Students are going to be bringing their own baggage and knowledge in. So where in your discipline might you see a student bringing something in that we could all benefit from knowing that a student might have to talk about? This is really sort of specifically as planning. Are there ways that you might plan to have some assignments, things that you might pair with it, coursework readings, things that you might do in your classes because you know that your first-year students, theoretically, will have all read this book? What are some ideas that you might have about how we can piggyback on that momentum? And then finally, this last one, you can see I took more in other words than the original words to explain what I meant. What I was curious about are the things that, if we're in the writing studies class and science comes up, as a scientist, what do you want to the students to hear? Things that students might often get wrong about a particular thing in your discipline, economics, politics, science, that you want to make sure that other professors be like, well, actually, maybe go check out this reading of that topic or understand the issue a little more complicatedly. I just couldn't anticipate, because I know as writing instructors, we hear a lot of less than ideal writing tips from other disciplines that we might wish we could sort of steer away from. So what things in your own discipline would you want other disciplines to have on their radar? Look out for kids misunderstanding democracy or carbonic acid or whatever it is. So just, if you've got any thoughts about how your own discipline, yeah, please.
So I'm actually a career advisor. I work with School of International Service undergrads. But something that occurs to me is that with a federal government that's not acting in this area in terms of policy, you have states and municipalities that are doing a lot of it. So it's an interesting observation about our federal system and how parts of it can work differently when a problem like this comes up. So for me, that's fascinating. Yeah. Even though I work more on the international side and getting closer to our own government and our own systems here.
That is really interesting.
And is California a good example of a state that's taking matters into its own hands?
Mm-hmm. Like Denver and Chicago, Chattanooga.
What's Chattanooga done?
I think they cleaned up. Didn't they have? They had some toxic situation there.
I just read, my friend, because I do research on fracking and water quality, and a friend of mine at a different university sent me this article about how a number of cities, in Ohio, and I think it was Ohio and some other places in the Midwest, that they were there's this movement about local self-governance and communities having more rights to protect their own environment. And it banning, the city of Pittsburgh, I think, banned fracking within its boundary, and I think this other one was about protecting the Great Lakes. And I don't think our government really reserves many rights for sub-state level government when it conflicts with the state or the federal government. But it was sort of maybe we should rethink that,
So I've already admitted I haven't read this book. So I teach in education. One class I teach is called Social Justice and Urban Education. And we spend some time in the class talking about environmental injustice and how that's going to impact students in urban school spaces. When I say that out loud, do you see intersections with her content? Because I'm not hearing you say that this is a climate change book.
It definitely is a climate change book. Yeah.
Well, so
yeah.
I think some connections could be if you wanted to make them. It's hard with urban areas in the U.S. because usually the environment has been changed so much there. There's not that many massive extinctions that happen in cities. Most of those, they kind of have already happened when the cities were growing. But it is a huge issue worldwide, because a lot of the world's biodiversity is in tropical areas, places with rainforests and cloud forests and coral reefs, and a lot of those are less wealthy developing nations that want to raise the standard of living for their citizens, and a lot of times it's also places with a lot of mineral resources. And so there's huge environmental justice issues around that. I lived in Ecuador for a while, and the president perhaps in good faith, perhaps not, was trying to do this thing like to raise a bunch, basically get the US and Europe and other countries to pitch in like half the amount of money he would get by destroying the rainforest and pumping oil out of it, and he would agree to leave the oil in the ground. The only one that ever gave any money was Germany. So that didn't really work. But and eventually it fell through. But I feel like there's stuff like that, like, because it's sort of the same thing with state and local municipalities too. Like these, like biodiversity and the Earth's services, they're like a common resource that we all rely on, but they're not distributed evenly across the world. Like we use more of them, but like Brazil produces like way more of oxygen because of the rainforest, and it houses like way more of the biodiversity. So how do you encourage the ones who have like the local power over the resource to preserve it like for you when you're not really, it's I feel like there are tons of environmental justice issues. There's also, I feel like there are some endangered species in cities. I feel like the thing is people's experience in cities is so removed from a lot of these places she goes to. Maybe that you could even talk about that. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it would be very easy to do that kind of work because, like in the ocean acidification thing, she talks about the effects on calcifiers and the food chain and effects on fishing. And if it's one little step to, communities off the northeastern coast of Africa who depend on fishing, and if their schools are being decimated, well, they're the ones suffering the immediate impact. And then, there's an example of that nation that had to move because they went underwater within the last couple of years. Like people had to leave their home because rising sea levels. And so the book walks you, I think, right up to a lot of these areas, and then all you do is say, all right, well, think about, and this actually gets I teach the complex problems course. It's a good example of how this is a great complex problems idea, because what seems like just maybe perhaps a very sciencey, wonky thing, well, let me take you one step further, show here are the human impacts of it, the social injustice of it, environmental injustice of it. It's right there waiting to be mined. So yeah, it very much is a climate change book.
And I guess another thing that just occurred to me was like thinking about like one of the impacts of climate change that she doesn't get into as much is just increased intensity of like storms and natural disasters. And I feel like those impact urban areas a lot. Like Hurricane Katrina, for example, it's like, an intersection of a storm that was probably exacerbated by climate change as well as like human incompetence and institutional racism. So it's kind of like all those things intersect.
It's also migration from rural places as a result of climate change into cities, which affects the sort of use of public resources in cities.
That's cool.
So I'm in writing studies, so we're right in the center of this also. But one of the things I'm thinking about as people are talking about this is even if the book doesn't fit exactly within the boundaries, of your course topic, it seems like, as Adam suggested, that it opens doors into further inquiry and connections that students can then make, right? So even if you don't teach the book, for example, if you have first-year students in your class and they're coming up with paper topics, this is a way, I think, to open the door into some inquiry, even if she's not talking about, well, what effect does ocean acidification have on urban poor people? That was a great paper topic for a student to do some research on, for them to find out. And so I think also thinking of it that way, even if it doesn't align completely with whatever your curriculum is or your plan for your class is, the students are a point of intersection. If you have first-year students where their knowledge of this book, I think, could lead to some really exciting avenues for research for them to connect to whatever work they're doing in your class. I think it can be really generative in that way. And of course that helps us because we always like to tell students that what they do in their college writing classes actually does matter elsewhere. And so it would be kind of reinforcing it from that direction too. So I think there are a lot of really exciting directions.
And just a quick piggyback off that, just as an idea, and I haven't done this, so I can't take any credit, but my colleagues who are far smarter and more clever than I am, I know they do things like this. If you showed the students the table of contents, you might ask them for, here's a concrete writing assignment, like, what chapter do you think she needs to include? Or with our class, if our class were going to be invited to do an anthology of, complementary pieces, what do you think we should include? What sort of element of research or what ramification, what kind of analysis? And so it might be a neat way to use the book just as a jumping off for a research assignment. What would you add to this book, or how would you challenge this book?
So I have a question, but I first wanted to say, because Karen mentioned it, that I'm from Germany.
Way to go!
But I'm paying taxes here.
As are we.
So I read the book on the crime reporter. What was it? Estrie. Yeah. And I also read Chan's book on resegregation. And I did that mainly because in the 2 years when these books had been assigned, I was co-teaching an honors core course on cities. So I thought it was, entirely obvious. And my experience has been that the students would not connect the material to the books. It seemed to me that, and these are honor students, university honor students, some had not actually read the book, it seemed. And the ones who clearly had read the book had a hard time relating the material. For me, that's not a reason to change anything about it, but what I've decided, because I'm teaching a different honors course now, which has nothing to do with cities or with climate change for that matter, is that rather than trying to relate the content to the topic of my course, I would like to ask you how I could bring in the dimension of how to scrutinize evidence, how to make an argument, how to disagree. Because for Chan's book, I found that impossible because not a single student would at American University dare to speak up against the argument that resegregation is going on.
Should have been in my class.
So you kind of, and it seems to me that the book is actually trying not to be normative. And I find that very helpful. With the crime reporter, there wasn't much normativity there. There was obviously more of a journalistic account. But so, against the background that I feel that for the past 2 years or so, and I'm hearing from students that students are increasingly uncomfortable to disagree in the classroom because they fear that they're going to be called discriminatory or singled out, or so it's kind of going with the flow, getting the temperature, and then agreeing with the political flavor. How can this book help deconstructing an argument and seeing issues from? I'm not talking about climate change denial. I want to talk about what are the issues in this book that, from a scientific perspective, you think there is disagreement and that there should be debate?
Well, so I've talked. I think I've maybe lucked out about this more teaching science because there are different views. I feel like it's not like with segregation where everyone knows what the right opinion is. One thing that has provoked a really good debate in my class is what to do about invasive species. I think, sort of the probably more common viewpoint is, they should be eradicated. But you break this down, and one, it's often impossible to do that. And two, even if you can do it, it's really expensive, and they just come back. And then the other thing is, you kind of break it down ethically, and it does sort of get a little tangled. There's this wonderful Radio Lab podcast about the Galapagos, and how there were these goats that were, brought to the Galapagos by some sailors, that I'm blanking on who exactly it was, but, the Spanish kind of going around, and they brought these goats and just sort of left them there so they'd be an ongoing food source. The goats proliferated. They ate everything, and moreover, they became very beautiful, and the locals like them. The problem is they eat all the vegetation, and the vegetation creates these drip pools for the tortoises, which are endangered and only occur in the Galapagos. So the government embarked on this brutal goat eradication program, which is described in detail in the podcast. Basically what they would do is hunt most of the goats, and then they would have this one poor goat that they would keep in heat, kind of, so that it was attracting the other goats.
Wow.
and put a radio collar on it. And then as the other goats approached, they would shoot them off one by one. This would go on for like years. And you read about this and you're like, okay, do the goats deserve that? Like, it's our fault they're there in the first place. And I feel like the students, I did get a variety of opinions about like what should be done. And like maybe the tortoises are going to go extinct anyway. You know, we might be committing all this violence for no real purpose. And also there's like sharpshooting of deer, and Rock Creek Park is like closer to home. So I think things like that, like what should be done about some of these things, can be good debates.
It also implies at one point that humans are invasive species.
Oh, obviously.
That's what I was wondering.
Yes.
Do you ever, like, once a kid is all like, we should, exterminate the invasive species, shoot every goat? Do you ever say, well, okay, human, you're the ultimate invasive species?
I guess I don't, because I try to keep, like, my own views out of it as much as possible. And also because clearly the rules we apply to other organisms don't apply to us. I think that's sort of obvious.
I was looking for moments where I would say this is 95% reporting and fact-based. And I was looking for moments where she may have sort of veered towards editorializing. And it seems like in a few moments she did that. One of my favorite bits was where I think it's a Swedish scientist, Sabo, in chapter 12 maybe, where she's talking about the Faustian angle of humans having a drive.
Oh, the madness
a drive
gene.
to take over the planet. And this is a Faustian element. Like this is a failing. It's just like a fault that's just doomed us. And millions of years from now, if the Earth still exists, then they're going to look back at us as just like they looked at the dinosaurs. But this one Swedish scientist is trying to. His project is to map the genome of the Neanderthals so that he can then compare the Neanderthals to the humans,
Right.
to see where the humans sort of veered away from the Neanderthals. Neanderthals didn't last, so they must not have had this drive. Humans have this drive, therefore we're taking over the planet. We are invasive everywhere we go, and we're doomed.
I found that part kind of shaky, actually. Yeah. Because I feel like not all human I feel like there's human cultures that did not really expand and conquer, and they're genetically the same people. Like the isolated cultures in the rainforest and stuff, I feel like they had much less. Like they probably expanded at some point, but there were a lot of cultures that expanded and then kind of just exterminated some species probably, and then reached a plateau and maintained an equilibrium for a very long time.
Yeah.
I feel like discussing it from a genetic perspective kind of negates the different impacts of different cultures that have been really different. And also, how do you know that the Neanderthals weren't just more susceptible to smallpox,
Liz?
Well, just thinking also from a more kind of research point of view and a writing point of view, one of the sections she has in there that I really like is she actually talks about the development of theories of extinction. And so, one person proposes one thing, kind of how science works and how knowledge works. One person proposes one thing and somebody comes up with a competing theory, and, they kind of work it out, and there are these different threads of understanding and knowledge coming together. And some of them do come together, and then some are kind of vanquished and put by the side. But it's a really nice, it's almost like the Thomas Kuhn, construction of scientific knowledge stuff. It's this really nice kind of capsule of how disagreement happens in science, and how it happens through writing and through books and through conferences, and sometimes in person too. Some of these people get together and talk it through. And so I think if you want to think of it in terms of how elements of the book can be an example of academic disagreement and constructive disagreement and inquiry and argument, I think that's a really good example of it, and that happens in the first few chapters And then throughout them, there are places where she points to competing theories and different views and disputes and things that are still open, which I think is really constructive for this topic, because so often what we hear kind of in the popular discourse is, well, they don't really know, so it must not be happening, right? These scientists are always disagreeing with each other, and so it must not be true. And she's really modeling the ways that, no, scientists don't agree with each other, and they're theorizing, and gradually that is how scientific knowledge happens. That's the way it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
And so I think pointing to that kind of, that sort of, epistemological construction within a discipline, I think is a really kind of sophisticated way to get students thinking about how disagreement really happens in academia, especially versus how it happens in the popular discourse around this topic. And so I think there are some avenues to get them to think a little bit more deliberately about how disagreement can happen, and why it's necessary, too. Why it's, in fact, not just necessary, it's essential to academia and to knowledge.
And how evidence is not necessarily like the end of the conversation. This is evidence. What do we do with this evidence?
It is that we use this conversation metaphor a lot in writing studies. This idea of the academic conversation that happens in text, it happens in conferences, it happens in offices, it happens in classrooms. And yeah, somebody presents something, and then the conversation isn't over. Right? It has to continue after that. And so I think that metaphor really shows up in the book.
Erin?
I'm just going to say, I always like comparing how academics do this type of discourse with how toxic discourse can be elsewhere, because our students are actually really good at pointing out how, if you compare like a Twitter thread on climate change with something that's happening here, and just say, okay, so what are some of the differences that you're seeing? Students will get really engaged and see how unproductive some discourses and how productive other discourses, and how it's actually really exciting to be in a place that values this discourse.
Just, go ahead, Karen.
I was just wondering, how do you know what discourse is productive?
I think that it's helpful. I think I would ask that of students, and I think that one thing that I think might be interesting is to talk about. But I think some Twitter threads, and they have a lot of scientists on Twitter who use it in really, really productive ways. So what I might do in a classroom is talk about, okay, so what do you see happening here? How is this different rhetorical context? Having different kinds of discussions that people are either using in different ways. It's obviously a different situation in the book. And get them thinking about what are the pros and cons of these different kinds of mediums. How might we use these forms in different ways?
Yeah, if your goal is to get people to support, the president's slashing all the environmental rules, Twitter could be continuously productive, right? So that's, I think, where we come back to the rhetorical context of whatever that discourse is.
Yeah, I guess I just feel like sometimes there's times for like nuanced discussion, and sometimes there's times for like blunt, repeated demands that don't budge.
Absolutely.
And like.
Yeah.
I have friends in town. I took them down to the new dinosaur exhibit down at the Natural History Museum, which it's fantastic. If you haven't gone, my friend is the head of IT there, so he's telling me, and I saw it's there. They've constructed it through deep time. So when you enter, you begin walking backward through time, and the fossils are getting older and older and older, trying to impress upon you. But talking about bold things, as you get near the end, painted up on the wall. I also took a picture of it from my office because I also teach a class at Darwin. They say, all living things on Earth evolved from a single species. And they just put it up on the wall. There's like no nuance. There's like, boom, we're not going to beat around the bush. We're just saying it. There it is right there. And I thought, whoa, good for you. So there you go.
A lot of discussion.
Yeah, it's like, there it is. It's a good exhibit. A couple things I was going to sort of help answer your thing, because you were talking about, like, it's not really the content you care so much about as how might the book help model more rhetorical things. One of the things that we talked about very early on in my class is the idea of expertise, and especially after November 2016, we talked about like what makes an expert, and is there things like objective or close to objective truths, and who do we trust and why do we trust? And so what the book might do is give you a way of sort of opening that can of worms of who does she go to, right? Like she gives people's credentials. What are credentials even doing? Right? Credence, the root of that is belief. Why do we believe some people and not others? Should we even? Some students come in, they try to be like complete relativists, and everyone's an expert, and everything's fake, and everything's constructed. And if I'm on the second floor, I'll say, well, if everything's constructed, then leave class to the second story window. Well, gravity. So gravity's like. So there are ways that the book might be stripped of content, what she does, the moves are there for kids. Like, she depends on experts. She tries to defend their expertise. And that might be a way into, here's how it matters for our conversations. If we're going to argue with one another in this class, who will be our source of expertise on different things, and why? Right? That's for us a really interesting question. Why do we give people credit? Why do we not give other people credit? And the last piece of sort of a random esoteric idea for you and for anybody else. Over the summer, I read Carl Sagan's book Cosmos. And it's just glorious. But one of the beautiful things that I kept marveling at, no matter what to us a seemingly crazy idea would be, like, so at one point he's talking about, they thought there were canals on the moon, and so he goes into, well, look, here's why people thought that. Here's the compelling argument for it, and then here are some of the arguments for and against it, and here's the science of how they kind of deconstructed, or not deconstructed, how they showed that some of these propositions weren't sustainable. And Sagan never. There were so many things he brought up about planets and stars that were like, well, that's a crazy idea. Like, people used to think that they were campfires of people on their way to heavens. And Sagan's like, he's not like, oh, isn't that cute they thought that, or patronizing. But he's like, well, here's the science of why that's problematic. And he gives like different, so he sincerely engages with any opinion, which I think has been, I teach this class on evil. That's one of the things that you have to bring to, and maybe the book is the way in. Like, no matter what a kid brings up, a student brings up, if we model for them, I'm going to take your ideas seriously. I'm not going to accept it blindly, but let's talk about corroborating evidence. Let's talk about how if you're right in this place, then it should make other things right. And this is kind of like the Herschelian way of arguing with another scientist. And so that idea of, if you have an idea, it's valid insofar as it functions. And it explains other phenomena and things like that. I think that might help students, get more comfortable with the idea of science and the idea of, there's disagreement in science. So when I've got a bunch of scientists who disagree, or a bunch of political science experts, how do I decide what I, student A, am going to feel about that thing, what I'm going to believe, what I'm going to think? How do I begin to weigh these complicated opinions? And so this one conversation on expertise might unlock that whole thing for a student. That's a thought. Other ways that your own disciplines might intersect with it, or even, as we get near the end, what challenges might students have that you are looking forward to, worried about? Yeah.
I'm teaching, I usually teach Photoshop and digital media, but I'm teaching writing for comm for the first time, and I have a journalism background, so I'm excited to be writing.
Cool.
And so even feel kind of on the outside approaching this book, but I am interested in science writing and making science appeal to the masses. I've done some medical stories or public policy stories where I totally nerd out about the issue, but it's sort of like, well, how do I make normal people who don't watch C-SPAN care about this issue, like people like my mom? So if I
Let's see, it was sex, death, catastrophe,
and personal health.
And personal health.
So that really appeals to me. I like these. I haven't read the book yet, but however science or other complex things can be made to appeal to the mass audience. Just like I used to hate pop music, but can put feminism in there. Thank you, Beyonce. People pay attention. So I think science writing, journalists should do more.
Yeah, and science. It's kind of about science, but it's sort of just about what's happening to us. Like she's not really talking. She doesn't spend she's not like, oh, and this is how we interpret the isotopic record of this mud core. Yeah, that is technical, or this is exactly how the chemistry of seawater is going to change. It's more descriptive, I think, than. So I don't know. I don't feel like you necessarily have to get into the scientific concepts behind it. I think it's more she's just documenting what is occurring.
And there are a good 10 or 12 times in the book where I just sort of put it down and said, that's just a lovely paragraph. That's a well-rendered story that sort of gets at what this particular problem is. Or that's a great line about the hand job. It just sort of sticks in your head.
I feel like the captive breeding programs are definitely another thing that would be a good debate. is there any point to this?
Yeah. Well, and also they talk about the frozen zoos, which seems of a kind. Like,
which are, I don't know if it was in this book, but those things are melting. There's one in Norway, and it's warming up, and it's just not going to stay frozen that much longer.
wait, like
the seed bank.
Oh, the seed bank.
Yeah.
Huh.
So.
Actually, and that's the common reaction I've heard from a couple of people is it's not a hopeful book. Like by the end. But Kelly, can you talk about what you had read in her interview with ProPublica about hope?
Yeah, so they asked her, should you give us some hope? And she said that wasn't really her aim, because it would seem like an easy thing to do, to try to give people hope. She'd rather challenge us. Maybe that's not even what she wants to do. She wants to give us the information so that we can come up with solutions. And I think maybe the subtext of the book is she says this outright a couple of times. Humans have a lot of ingenuity, and they're good at getting out of problems, solving problems, getting out of really problematic situations. So she's guardedly optimistic, but she doesn't want to say all the solutions are easy. We have to figure them out.
Any other ways that you might, final thoughts of things that you thought about for your own classes, things you might have students do or read that other people might think about pairing with their own classes? Texts that have sprung to mind?
I'll just add, so in my writing class, I have them read this great piece called Looking for Trouble. Who writes that?
Savini, right?
Looking for Trouble. It's in Writing Spaces, which is an online collection of pieces by rhetoricians. But it's called Looking for Trouble. And the premise of Looking for Trouble is mostly writing students looking for a way into a text. They should look for the trouble in the text. And the trouble could be a question that the student has about it, or I think this is a challenge that I'd like to dig more into, that the text doesn't really go as far into as I think it should be gone into. So that's some trouble that I want to sort of dig into myself. So my students are going to read this, and then they're going to read Looking for Trouble, and then their first major writing assignment is to find trouble in the book that they'd like to investigate further. Kolbert sort of took them up to a certain point, and they want to go past that point.
All right. Well, then I guess thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good semester.